right, so today I want to talk about combining the mutually exclusive. And what I kind of mean by that is this mutually exclusive idea between science and art. So on my screen at the top left, you can kind of see this Venn diagram, right? So on one side is science and on one side is art. And in the middle, it has this overlap of wonder. All right, so that's cool, I guess. I mean, this Venn diagram does seem to show to us that they overlap in some way. But if we really look at these visuals, it's just so apparent how our mind is instantly starts thinking that these two fields are completely different, that they really can't be combined or anything like that. On the left side, we can see these mathematical equations kind of attesting to the logic, the black and white of science. And then on the right, we have the abstract of art, which is attributed to creativity and logic. And really, I think that comes down fundamentally to how we think about our brain. When we think about our brain in the bottom right, we always think that there's some people that have an analytical, logical kind of mind, and that they're better suited for just science. And then we think, oh, there's other types of people that are creative. And for me, when I started out in my journey through STEM for social good and with art, I started leaning instantly towards STEM. I was like, I can't be a creative person, I'm a STEM person. And I've started realizing that's wrong, and here's how. So today I kind of want to talk about first my research, which is really what got me into STEM for social good, and understanding how STEM for social good is really just not something that should be exclusively just for STEM. And how I realized that was I've been a singer all my life. And so that's the kind of second part of my journey where I started combining my music and my CS passions. And as I started doing that, I started coming to these realizations about what using STEM really means and whether, again, is it just exclusively STEM? And finally, the fourth part of my journey was helping students come to the same realizations that I did, that art and science are not simply mutually exclusive. Okay, so starting off with my research. I started my research last year, actually, at the Ubiquitous Computing Lab, and today is our submission date for a research paper, which is really exciting. But last summer, I started off with a full-time internship at the University of Washington's Ubiquitous Computing Lab. And so what ubiquitous computing really refers to is the idea that computing can be involved in all aspects of our life, from health to simply daily life activities like getting coffee. The lab has done many projects on recognizing text, sending signals to random items in your kitchen, and multiple other projects like that. But my project was really focused on health and computing, so I'm kind of going to get into that. The motivation behind this project was really the idea that the Fitbit is not a device that works for everyone. So the Fitbit is an example of ubiquitous computing. We've all kind of seen it in either our life or one of our peers or friends or family's life. People often use it to measure their step count. And how the Fitbit works is that it's essentially just a wristband, and inside the wristband is an accelerometer or gyrometer. And using that device, the Fitbit can count how many steps you're walking as a measure of physical activity. And physical exercise is a really important thing to measure, particularly nowadays. Clinicians are often prescribing physical exercise as almost like a medication for a lot of problems that patients have. But not all populations can walk for exercise. If we look at our sedentary, obese, or disabled populations, they're not always able to just go walking and running whenever they want, as all of us are fortunate enough to be able to do. Instead, what a lot of clinicians do is prescribe upper body exercises to these patients. So examples of upper body exercises include arm lifts, they include bicep curls with like cans of soup, and these types of things really help these populations stay in shape rather than walking or running. And the Fitbit does not work to quantify those type of exercises. So how can we ensure that patients like these are able to quantify their exercise and have something where they're able to track the amount of physical exercise they're doing for their health without using something like the Fitbit? So that's where our research idea really stemmed from. At the bottom, you can see this diagram of a phone. And what those purple lines are indicating is the pinnacle of this project, which is sonar sensing. And what sonar sensing means is that we're actually able to sense what types of activity the user is doing just through sound. So here's how it works. Picture this. You take your phone, you put it on a table in front of you, and it emits a constant frequency. Or this is what we started out with, a constant frequency. Now this frequency is very, very high, such that you're not able to hear it, and neither are any of your family members or anything like that. It's a very high frequency. However, whenever you're doing movements or even just sitting there, that sound is constantly getting reflected back to the phone. So if we measure through the phone's microphone, we're actually able to see those tiny changes in how the sound is being reflected back. And those changes seem pretty tiny, but if we look at it on a graph, it's actually pretty incredible to see how easily we're able to look at different exercises and what they look like. So this over here, these two graphs show kind of what I was working on throughout the past year on my project. So at the top we have an exercise, and what we can see here is a lot of different repetitions. Now this is really cool. Just by recording through a phone's microphone, we're able to see these clear patterns of exercises where each one of these bumps is actually just a repetition. And so clearly from this, we can see that it's pretty easy to apply simple computing techniques and figure out how many exercises are actually on this graph. And that was one part of our project, this repetition counting, where we were looking at each of these different peaks and figuring out how many repetitions a user had done. Again, just through your phone and putting it down on a table. Then the other part of our research was classification. So looking at this top graph and this bottom graph, we can instantly see that they're very different exercises. One has this clear bumpy kind of shape, whereas the other one just looks more like a lot of lower frequencies. And then we were able to segment these with a repetition counting algorithm that we kind of pioneered. So these were the two parts of my project, classification and repetition counting. And honestly, this entire project was really attesting to the idea of STEM for social good, because we were able to use STEM to bring more inclusivity into activity trackers, because now patients were able to use this model that we made to track their upper body exercises that they weren't able to track before. But let's go back to the pinnacle of this argument that art and science aren't mutually exclusive. How did I come to that conclusion? So I have been singing all my life. I've been singing Indian classical music, which is something that not a lot of people are familiar with. But in Indian classical music, there's this idea down here in this image of almost scale patterns. They're called rags. And what those are essentially different scale patterns, and they have very clearly identifiable characteristics associated with each of them. And essentially, there's certain patterns of notes that are repeated multiple times in individual rags and things like that. So when I thought about these rags, I had to think about them for my exam in Indian classical music. We were asked to hear a scale pattern. Our teacher would sing it to us, and we would have to identify exactly what rag it was just by hearing it. Which is it was really confusing for me. When I heard these, I was like, how is it possible to figure out that this pattern is associated with this rag and this other one is associated with this scale pattern? It was really difficult. And this was happening at the same time that I was conducting my research. And so it kind of just instantly popped into my mind. So I'm trying to take these different patterns of notes and classify them into 10 different rags. You know, it's just a simple matter of correlation, like this pattern correlates to this rag. Now, what if I was able to do that with a computer? Could a computer do this task that I was struggling with so much? And that actually spurred me into a year-long research project on applying machine learning to these skills. So I took exactly what I had learned from my research in computing, and I was able to apply it to music. And that's when I kind of realized that it's weird that when we think about music or computer science or drawing and coding, we think of it as just completely different things. Like, we can never combine those. And once I did this project, my machine learning model was actually able to identify these scale patterns with an 87% accuracy, which was crazy because I was barely at like 50% myself. And so it's really interesting that these computers can decode art, and it almost makes it seem as though art also has a foundational logic behind it, a kind of foundation that's maybe even as black and white as we consider science to be. So as I started realizing that, art and science can be combined, it started popping up everywhere in my life almost. I've also been a dancer all my life in addition to being a singer. And in dance, when you first look at it, you think of it as a completely classical art. But if you look at it a little further, dance also has underlying rhythm. There's mathematics to it. As a dancer, I'm constantly thinking about whether my beats are fitting in to the rhythm right, and if everything is, going on beat. And that's purely mathematics. So I realized dance was a combination of math and expression in itself. And then another thing that I'm really passionate about is model rocketry. I've been doing it for almost 6 years now. And again, instantly looking at rocketry, we're not used to thinking of anything in rocketry as a kind of art. But again, if you think about it closer, when you design a rocket, when you're designing anything, isn't there an element of creativity, an element of art? So it was really crazy to me that as I looked around, almost everything around me was a product of art and something from STEM. And as I realized this, I started thinking about my community. So a lot of things that we're used to hearing now in our community is this idea of STEM versus STEAM, and the lack of participation of girls in computer science versus art. We can kind of see that on this graph over here, where 35% of girls are interested more in STEAM, whereas boys are interested more in the STEM part of things. And what I realized was that this is really a product of our society, Even when I started studying CS, people in my school automatically kind of considered me a coding person, like, oh, we're working on this project, like, why don't we give Anshita the math and science part of this, because she's a CS person. But I'm not just a CS person, I'm also a dancer, I'm also a singer, I'm also a creative. And so I realized that this is probably part of why girls feel so intimidated to start CS, because STEM is looked at upon this thing as something that's completely different. And so I actually started working with other students and teaching coding with an art-based approach, working on generating music with coding, working on programs like web design, and really bringing in the art side of things to teach coding to students. And that's been a really valuable experience for me. So how does this connect back to STEM for social good? I think that when we look at STEM for social good, we can't just consider it as STEM for social good. It's more than that. It's about approaching these problems with the creative part of our brains as well, and solving our social problems with a combination of what we know from both art and from science. And yeah, I hope as you go into your life, you'll think about how you can start applying art into things that you normally considered as being logical. And I think that's what really makes our journeys unique, is being able to combine those two fields in whatever way is best for us, and creating our own journey by fusing boxes. Thanks.